Thank you very much, Frank. I, as always, want to commend you for the terrific work you're doing for our nation's national security. I discovered and admired Frank's work as a graduate student, the Ph.D. student, and wrote to him, and he actually wrote me back. So I will remember it fondly. I came back from Ukraine 10 days ago. I was in Kiev speaking at the Adam Smith Institute annual conference on energy. But before we get into my impressions, I would like to start with the murder of someone who was a friend for many years, for over 2 decades. Boris Nemtsov. Boris Nemtsov was a wonderful individual, a true believer in a different path for his country, for Russia. And I took it very personal because almost a year ago in April, I ran into Boris in the street in Israel. And I said, "What are you doing here?" And he said, "I'm taking a break because they announced me as a national traitor. And my picture is in the middle of Moscow with the inscription, national traitor, together with some other people that I know." And I spent, a couple of days later, 2 hours with Boris trying to convince him not to go back. Said, this is just as they declared my grandfather an enemy of the people and shot him, shot my grandfather, and millions of people who were declared enemies of the people. And he didn't listen. He said, I have a commitment to my voters. He was elected to a regional council in the town of Yaroslavl, and he went back and he paid the ultimate price for his belief in a democratic path for his country. And after Boris was killed on the nights of 27th to 28th of February, several days later, Mr. Putin disappeared and was AWOL for about 10 days, 11 days, to be exact. And then different telltale signs in the Russian media told me that we're going to see him coming back in full force. And he did. And immediately the tone of the investigation of Nemtsov's murder changed and was redirected from the Chechens who were associated with a Chechen strongman named Kadyrov, Ramzan Kadyrov, a Putin associate, to somehow Chechens who are fighting on behalf of Ukraine in Ukraine. And there's this strange explanation that I think nobody believes, that somehow the Ukrainians would be behind the murder of my friend Boris Nemtsov. This is to show that this battle, this war in Ukraine has many aspects, and an important aspect of it is the information aspect. And I'm afraid that when we get involved in a debate about weapons and to train, not to train, we just saw to my shock that the commander of U.S. Army Europe just came out on Tuesday and said, we should not train them. Well, if we're not going to train them, then the explanation that our government has that we cannot supply weapons to the Ukrainians because they don't know how to use it. Here we go. So if they're not trained in how to use American weapons, we cannot supply American weapons. And then the gentleman had another explanation. We are concerned, he said, that if we give them weapons, they'll kill civilians. Well, there are literally thousands of civilians killed in that conflict on both sides. The official numbers that UN is disclosing is over 5,000 people killed, many of them civilians. And when you go to Ukraine and you sit down with the National Security Advisor and others, they tell you that it's 5,000 on each side. That's what they told me in August. Since then, they had Debaltseva encirclement and other things that probably that number now is close to 15,000 or more. There is still this myth that the Russians are not fighting in Ukraine. It's a myth. There are many Russian people, soldiers, who were ordered to volunteer in Ukraine. And when they say volunteer, it means that they surrender their documents. If they're killed or maimed, they have no rights. Their families do not get compensation, or if they get compensation, they sign paperwork that they will not disclose where their dear ones were killed in action or where they're maimed. It is a huge human tragedy. It is a very tragic conflict because for many, on both sides, Ukrainians and Russians were very close. They're Christian Orthodox. They speak each other's language. A lot of Ukrainians, of course, speak Russian. Not so many Russians speak Ukrainian. But what worries me here, beyond my sympathy to sovereignty and independence of Ukraine, is that we do not have a clear policy response on behalf of the United States and on behalf of our European allies. And we don't have the response of the European allies because we don't have strong American leadership. I think the sanctions overall were a step in the right direction. It was a right way to approach this. The sanctions identified Russia's economic vulnerability. I was in Moscow in the end of November, and senior people were saying, la, 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 not worrying, you know, do whatever you want. This is not about money. This is about Mother Russia and the soil and the blood. And I use the soil and the blood deliberately because Frank knows the connotation in European history of who talked about, I don't have the original German, unfortunately, the soil and the blood. And when you do, as I do, spend 2 hours examining and dissecting the language of Vladimir Putin in the recent documentary, where he takes full credit for the annexation of the Crimea, where he discloses that he ordered the 4 security chiefs, the head of the Security Council, the Minister of Defense, probably the Chief of Staff, he doesn't name them, but he ordered them to start taking steps for the annexation of the Crimea on the night of the 22nd to the 23rd of February, a significant date because the 23rd of February is the Red Army Day. And he admits publicly on tape that the order to annex came way before the referendum and that he sent the special forces, and he names them, the GRU Spetsnaz and the military, the naval infantry, the Marines, into the Crimea to secure the referendum. And he orders a clandestine poll in the Crimea to gauge the public support, and said, I do not want to do anything that the Russians in the Crimea will not support. But he talks about Russians. He doesn't talk about the Ukrainians in the Crimea. He doesn't talk about the Crimean Tatars. He ignores the historic fact that the reason there is a majority of Russians in the Crimea is because his predecessor, Joseph Stalin, ethnically cleansed the Crimea. And when I was a little kid growing up there were orchards that were abandoned that nobody knew from the new resettled Russian peasants how to tend, because they had this arik, the little irrigation channels that you need to bring the water from the mountain rivers and streams and creeks. It was a very elaborate system that was abandoned because the Crimean Tatars were kicked out. And the Crimean Tatars, in a desperate attempt, tried to stop this referendum. And of course the Spetsnaz prevented them from stopping the vote in the so-called Russian Crimean parliament. Not only that, the man whose party got 3.5%, this is the Russian idea of democracy, 3.5% got a recognized organized crime figure named Sergei Aksyonov. He was nominated the prime minister. He is still the prime minister of the Crimea. A woman who betrayed her oath to the Ukrainian state and went to the Crimea has become the prosecutor general of the Crimea. This thing is about as democratic as what we saw in the late 30s in Europe. It is all orchestrated. It's all organized. And then Mr. Putin takes all the responsibility upon himself. In the Russian blogosphere, everybody said this is enough to indict him in The Hague. But what was interesting, he did not share that credit with anybody. He thinks that this is a great success. And you saw, after he reappeared, the first thing he did was to put the Northern Fleet, part of the Russian Navy, to put it on full alert. Well, from our Cold War days, we remember what the Northern Fleet is. The Northern Fleet has the lion's share of the sea-launched nuclear weapons. And this is the reality we're dealing with today. We are in a Cold War posture by Russia that is worse than anything I remember in my lifetime short of the Caribbean Cuban Missile Crisis. It is an unprecedented warlike posture, and it is dangerous. He sends his rickety old Tupolev 95, the Bear bombers, and as an aside, I'm World War II aviation buff. Do you know what is the original platform design of Tupolev 95? Who knows? It's, sorry about that. It's a B29 Stratoforders. 4 of them crashed in the Far East. Stalin ordered them copied, and Tupolev, the great aristocratic Russian bomber designer, said, yes, Comrade Stalin, we can copy it. They copied it. Then they captured the Junkers, the Nazi designers, the engine designers, and the Nazis already had turboprop design. Nobody else had that. They put the Nazi turboprop design on the stretch B29, and that's a Bear that's still flying. It's an amazing story. So these Bears are flying all over Europe without ID. They sometimes come close enough to crash into civilian jets, and you have, granted, a not the most reliable boomer fleet and attack submarine fleet in the north that can shoot SLBMs through the ice if necessary. They said they're going to build up the Black Sea Fleet, and as always for 250 years of Russian history, the Crimea gets the Southern Fleet, then it sails through the Turkish Straits, the Bosphorus, into the Mediterranean and into the Indian Ocean and the Atlantic. We have seen this movie before. So what can we do? As I said, I think the sanctions is a step in the right direction. Clearly, the Obama administration is not listening to the majority of people in Congress who support lethal defensive weapons supply to Ukraine. And while General Bridgelov repeatedly said we need to support Ukraine more, we saw with the army commander not being so enthusiastic. In my view, there is one clear direction that we can do, and that is the supply of old Soviet-era weaponry that the Ukrainian army has an easier time absorbing and using, that they're familiar with those systems, be it tanks, artillery, jets, you name it. It may be not as precise, it may be not as sophisticated, but there's also a plus to that. Spare parts, familiarity of the officer corps with those systems. And there are tons of it in Poland, Czech Republic, Slovakia, Bulgaria, Romania, and elsewhere around the world. In addition to that, President Poroshenko was at the Gulf weapons exhibition or whatever, and there were reports that United Arab Emirates are going to supply some of it, some of the weapons to Ukraine. But in my view, after being to Ukraine 4 times, if not 5 times in the last year, I can tell you that the weapon systems are not the only thing that they need. They clearly need the weapon system. And they need specific things that we could supply, like the artillery radars that can identify sources of artillery fire. What they need is training. And they need training on the level of soldiers and NCOs, but they desperately need training on this level of colonels and general officers, because no trained general would have allowed the Debaltseve encirclement or the Ilovaisk encirclement in August, which was even worse, where thousands of people were killed unnecessarily, because if they saw this structure where they were surrounded from 3 sides, they would not have allowed that to happen. It is not surprising that the country that did not fight for 23 years, that its leadership allowed its army to go to seed, that the only people they have fought in Afghanistan in the framework of a much larger military operation under the Soviet command, and we know how that ended. And it's a very different terrain. It's a very different type of war. It was, you know, classic Afghanistan guerrilla war. We just fought one, and it's tough. So the Ukrainians need talent. They need leadership. And I think it's in our strategic interest to have Ukraine independent, to have Ukraine restore its territorial integrity, and to send a message to Mr. Putin, who is desperately seeking, remember this, what was it, Woody Allen's movie, Desperately Seeking Susan? He's desperately seeking conflicts. I was preparing for this talk. I found now his head of National Security Council going to Karelia, which is on the border of Finland, and says, the Finns are threatening us in Karelia. That they took a big chunk of Karelia. Stalin took it in 1940. That too is occupied territory. That was a war of aggression. Just as Mr. Putin admitted. The only excuse to use military force, if I'm not mistaken, under the UN whatever in chapter 57, what is it? The chapter, I think. Something like that, is if Russia was attacked. Russia was not attacked. And Putin's complaint in that film is why Yanukovych was such a weakling. He refused to sign the order to shoot to kill the opposition. And I hear this message from Russian officials all the time, that when people rise in demand of freedom, we have to shoot to kill. The books this thick published in Russia, among other people, by Vyacheslav Molotov's grandson, Vyacheslav Nikonov, arguing that the big mistake of the Tsarist regime that led to the Bolshevik victory, that his grandfather engineered, whether they didn't shoot to kill. So we need to internalize it and understand what are we dealing with. Of course we have the jihadi threat. My concern is that as Russia enters this Cold War posture, first of all, it's not going to be the exact repeat of the 1940s, 1980s Cold War. This will be a Cold War run by KGB officers, not by the aging Politburo, not by cautious Joseph Stalin. Joseph Stalin was a cautious, murderous dictator, but he died in his bed, unlike Hitler, like Mussolini. These guys would use very sophisticated instruments of power, including propaganda. We talked about information. But in my research, I also found, for example, in Putin's movie, he talks about it. The night wolves. Who knows what the night wolves are? It's a biker gang. They used a biker gang as a Spetsnaz unit in the Crimea. Putin personally cultivates them. He shows up at the biker conventions. He is buddies with the leader of the gang, of the night wolves, called the chirurg, the surgeon. And he's called the surgeon because he likes to cut people. So think about Europe. Think about what politicized biker gangs on the extreme right. I did not hear about left-wing biker gangs. But look at Greece. They would play both ends against the middle. The extreme left, and we remember the Baader-Meinhof and the Red Brigades, etc. And now, Marine Le Pen getting €9 million loan from Russia, and others. It is not, I'm convinced, going to stop with Ukraine. It started in the Baltic states. Apparently Finland now is in play. And yesterday, in the center of Moscow, the slogans. And as someone who grew up in the Soviet Union until the age of 16, I can tell you about the slogans. There's no such thing as accidental slogans. Even in this country, there are no accidental slogans and political conventions. The slogans in Moscow yesterday were Poland and Finland next. Ladies and gentlemen, we are living in interesting times. Thank you very much.
Ariel.